today's video we're going to be looking at a GCSE topic again, which is hurricanes. This is on the climate section in paper 1, which is world geography. So I'm going to run you through processes of the formation of a hurricane, and then we're going to have a little look at impacts and the case studies and management, but you'll need to fill in some of that information. So we're going to start with really the basics. So hurricanes always start over the oceans, and the oceans need to be 26.5 degrees or hotter, otherwise we just don't have the heat in order to drive a hurricane. It will just be a tropical storm. They also often start their life off the coast of West Africa, where there's lots of storms forming because the air's nice and hot, and very often hurricanes are formed by clusters of 2 to 3 or maybe 4 storms kind of getting together and forming one huge storm. So that's often the formation of them as well. You need very little in the way of upper wind shear as well, and what that means is the upper air in the top of the troposphere or the bottom of the troposphere, it needs to be not very strong, otherwise it will pull the storm apart and we won't get a hurricane forming. Hurricanes are intense areas of low pressure, which means that the air is rising in huge amounts and cooling, condensing and forming clouds. So if we look at our diagram, we can see that it forms over the oceans. We've got huge amounts of air that's been heated by the ocean, and that hot air will then rise. It's full of moisture, will cool and condense and form huge tropical storms. If those tropical storms become very, very strong and coalesce and group together, then we can have a hurricane forming. A hurricane is classified by a storm that has winds of over 74 miles an hour. So if it's under 74 miles an hour, it'll be classified as a tropical storm. If it's over 74 miles an hour, it will be classified on the Saffir-Simpson table as being a hurricane. So it can be 1 to 5 on that scale. So 1 is the least strong winds of 74 miles an hour, and number 5, grade 5 category hurricane is well over 100 miles an hour, well over 100 miles an hour. Winds always blow in an anti-clockwise direction, and we get that spinning, and we'll look at that spinning in a minute. So we've got the hot air rising, cooling, condensing, forming clouds. Okay, so hurricanes also can only form either side of the equator. Can't form on the equator because we don't have the impacts of the Coriolis effect, so we don't get that spin starting. So north and south of the equator, most hurricanes are between the tropics and form either side of the equator. So we can also only get hurricanes happening within the tropics, because if they start, they can't form outside the tropics because the sea surface temperatures just aren't high enough, and we will only get storms forming. So they've got to be within the tropics and either side of the equator. So hurricanes can be 500 miles an hour, 500 miles wide, and they can be about 9 miles tall. So we're talking about huge systems here, huge powerful systems. They form north and south of the equator, not on the equator. And as we said before, outside the tropics, if they move outside the tropics, they'll often dissipate or break up and stop being hurricanes, because the sea surface temperatures aren't high enough to drive the storm. And also if they hit land, they will dissipate as well. They will break up because the land isn't hot enough, again, to feed the hurricane. So the hot air rises, cools, condenses, forms clouds, and this is driven by the huge amount of heat that comes off the oceans. And remember, they generally form at the end of the summer, when the oceans have had a chance to heat up to the highest temperatures that there will be. They've taken in all that heat over the summertime, and they will become very, 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 very hot, and that hot water will heat the air above it, and that hot air will rise. So we're just going to now look briefly at impact. So impacts, your 2 case studies will need to be a high income country, which is normally the USA, and a low income country, which could be Bangladesh or could be Haiti. Doesn't really matter which, as long as you've got contrasting case studies. Now, most of the impacts are caused through 2 things that happen. Very, very high winds, which you talked about before, will cause a lot of damage, and storm surges will cause a lot of damage as well. And if we remember, a storm surge is where the very, very strong winds in the hurricane move the ocean in terms of waves, and those waves get very, very strong because those winds are very strong, pushing the water, and when that water comes in contact with the coast, those very high waves will overtop onto the land, causing huge amounts of flooding, especially if the area is flat, and that's what a storm surge is. So most of the impacts are caused by storm surges and very high winds. Now, our two case studies are the USA and Bangladesh. Now, we need to remember that most of the impacts will be on property and also on people. In the USA, there is quite a lot of damage done by hurricanes because obviously the property is very expensive, and along the coastline, if any things are destroyed or any property is destroyed, etc., then that's going to cost a lot of money. Roads and infrastructure will be impacted, so that will cause an impact, a knock-on effect on businesses, so we'll lose money there as well. However, in Bangladesh, places like Bangladesh, you could argue that the impacts are greater, maybe not in monetary value, but definitely in terms of how much devastation occurs, because obviously buildings aren't built strong enough, and there's a lot of people living on the coastline in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a very low-lying area, only a couple of meters above sea level, and most people live on the coast, on the area of the delta, in order to farm. So if we have lots and lots of storm surge there, a lot of water on the land, then that's going to put salt water on crops, which they're going to die. And then obviously the government in Bangladesh isn't economically advanced enough to rebuild quickly. So we could argue both ways really, that Bangladesh will have the greatest amount of damage in terms of the amount of people who are affected and what those effects are, especially with death and injury. Whereas in the USA, although we do get deaths, not generally as many, and also a lot of this is property, which can overall and generally be rebuilt quicker. So there are case studies. You'll need some facts and figures for these, so you'll need to look at that in the textbook. And the final thing associated with hurricanes is the management of them. So really, we're talking about prediction in terms of what technology can be used, what satellites can be used, what meteorological information can be used to track that hurricane, to look at its track or its path, to tell us where that hurricane's going to be, so we can look at moving people out the way or getting people out the way, and planning for it, getting people out the way. So moving people, evacuating people, moving them to safe places. If that's in the case of the USA, then that's going to be done really quickly and effectively because people have got TV, they've got access to radio, they've got mobile phones, etc. So lots and lots of information from satellites, from the Met Office, both in the United States and the UK. Quite often that data is used for them. So we'll be able to predict, not always 100%, but we'll be able to predict where we think that hurricane's going to go, and then put things in place to plan to move people out the way and to get people to safety. If we're talking about in poorer countries, then obviously their access to technology is a lot less. So although we do have some access to technology in Bangladesh, very often the Bangladesh government uses information from Japanese satellites, but we've got to remember that even though some people have mobile phones, quite often getting the information to the people to evacuate is not as effective as it is in richer countries. So evacuation may be better in America. We don't have the amount of places to go, evacuation stations or hurricane-proof buildings. We don't have as many, although there are more in Bangladesh which have saved lives. That's in your case study in your book. And rebuilding is obviously going to be a lot quicker and easier in America because they've got taxes which they can use to do that. Whereas in Bangladesh, they don't have the fortune of that, so they'll take a lot longer. So there'll be a lot more longer term impacts in places like Bangladesh, and there'll be a lot more shorter term impacts in the USA. So that's our causes of hurricanes, our impacts, and our management. So with those three things, we should be able to cover most of our shorter answer questions, or 2 or 4 mark questions, maybe with a source, and also maybe a longer case study on the impacts, and maybe a question on assess which country has the worst impacts. Then as long as you are sensible with your case study detail, then you could possibly argue both America in terms of the amount of damage, but Bangladesh in terms of the number of people that are impacted and the fact that it's longer term, the impacts are longer term. So that is hurricanes.